Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Isaac. Before we get started, I just want to point your attention to the Jersey City Free Public Library main website. You can access this website at www.jclibrary.org. And on the calendar of events section, you can find out about more segments like today, more read out loud sessions, more lectures, and all sorts of entertainment that's happening throughout the day and throughout the week. Today, we have an author talk with Dr. Elizabeth Drayson with her recent book, The Moor's Last Stand, How 7 Centuries of Muslim Rule in Spain Came to an End. Dr. Elizabeth Drayson was an undergraduate at Newham College, Cambridge, and is currently Lorna Close Fellow in Spanish at Maury Edwards College, college lecturer in Spanish at Peterhouse, and an affiliated lecturer in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. She specializes in medieval Spanish literature and cultural history and the relationship between Arabic, Jewish, and Christian culture during the Middle Ages and early modern period. Her current book project is a history of the city of Granada, which will be published as a monograph, Granada, Spain's Lost Paradise by Head of Zeus in 2020. Her last book, The Moor's Last Stand, How 7 Centuries of Muslim Rule in Spain Came to an End, was published in April 2017 by Profile Books and appeared in paperback in 2018. Dr. Drayson received her master's and PhD at the University of Cambridge. Thank you for being with us and welcome.
Thank you very much, Isaac, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be in touch with you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. There's a dominant narrative that Black history starts with slavery. This narrative often leads to a common understanding that Black people come from a history of strife. The Moor's history reminds us that Black people come from a rich history of culture, religion, and power. In our author talk today, we will examine the history of the Moors. So my first question to you, Dr. Drayson, is that The Moor's Last Stand is an extraordinary research book covering a wide range of Moorish Spain. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, I think probably there were 3 main reasons, Isaac. And the first one was that I'd written a couple of books before that on sort of subjects related to it. I'd written a book on the 7/11 Muslim invasion of Spain. And the events and legends surrounding that. And I'd also written a book about the converted Muslims in Granada called Moriscos and their history in the 16th century. But that was just before they were expelled from Spain in 1609. And I suppose I wanted to, in a way, having looked at where Muslim Spain began, I wanted to look at where it ended as well. That was one thing. Second thing is that 1492, as I'm sure people know, is one of those really exceptional historical years where of exceptional importance. And not only did Granada fall to the Christians and there was the end of Muslim rule in Spain, or the Jews were also expelled from Spain in the same year. And of course, Columbus set sail in August of that year and discovered what we call the New World. So it was a really big year, but I felt that the importance of the fall of Granada and the end of Muslim Spain probably isn't widely acknowledged or significantly acknowledged. And I wanted to draw attention to that. And within that, I wanted to tell the story from the point of view of the conquered. And it's a sort of cliche, isn't it, in history that history is written by the victors, which it has been in this case. So no one had written this story from Boabdil's point of view, the point of view of his people, and that was something I felt was really important.
Mm-hmm. The Moor's history dates back to medieval times. What is the difficult part of writing and researching this era?
Well, I think the most difficult part really is the fact that there aren't very many sources left, particularly in Arabic. We've only got one source in Arabic that was written at the time, or more or less the time Boabdil lived. And the others are Christian sources. The reason we haven't got many Arabic or any Arabic chronicles and sources left that are contemporaneous is that many Arab books were burnt just before 1500. Cardinal Cisneros, who was the Inquisitor General of Spain at the time, had a big book burning in a square in Granada, and he burnt an awful lot of very important books. So I think that's part of the reason why we haven't got more Arabic sources and therefore more of an Arabic point of view. But we have got this one. So that was one thing. And so it was hard, but I thought it was important to find a balanced view really of such momentous events. And I wanted to show the actual recorded view of people at the time, rather than the sort of later, more imaginative presentations of the life of the last Sultan of in Spain.
Why did he burn the books?
Because it was prohibited. It was prohibited to own any books in Arabic at that time. It was considered to be heretical by the Catholic authorities, and so all books were rooted out in Granada and in other places too, and just destroyed. So it was a colossal loss to Arabic culture.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to get straight into the book and talk about your first chapter. You titled it "The Nasty Dynasty of Granada." Why did you choose this title?
That's a good question, Isaac, actually. Well, I chose the title and to start with the Nasrids because they were really the reason that Islam survived in Spain for, I suppose, over 250 years more than they might have done. Mm-hmm. When the first emir, the first sultan of the Nasrids, who was called Muhammad I, made Granada his capital, and that was back in 1237. He started something. He started a society which lasted for another, as I said, 250 years. And at the time when he started it, the wonderful caliphate in Cordoba had collapsed. The two invasions by Almoravids and Almohads from the north of Africa, they'd also collapsed their states, and so it looked as if Islam was doomed in Spain. But against all the odds, if you like, Granada survived and actually became an Arabic-speaking Islamic state, and the last one in Europe, in fact. Mm-hmm. So that's why I started with them. And I think another reason was that the history of the Nasrid dynasty illustrates their power, but also their decadence. And we can see how the terrible rivalries and conflicts and fighting between families and clans that was a repeated pattern throughout those 250 years really had a big impact on Boabdil's reign and his life, and one that he couldn't really overcome.
There's a genealogical table. I think it would be nice for viewers to be able to see what you've uncovered and unpacked in this book.
Okay, let's see if I can get that then. Okay, so there we are. Apologies for the dates scrawled across the top. Mm-hmm. It's actually in Spanish, but the names of the sultans are correct as you see them. Mm-hmm. So we can see from this that Boabdil was the 23rd, actually out of 24 sultans in this dynasty, mm-hmm. Starting in 1232, which was when Muhammad I proclaimed himself emir. And it's interesting, I think, that if we look at the bottom of the lineage chart, above Muhammad XI, Boabdil, we see his uncle, Al-Vagal, was Muhammad XII, and he was the 24th Sultan, mm-hmm. which is quite interesting because for a period of time he did rule in Granada when Boabdil had been ousted for a period, but then Boabdil won Granada back. So it's a very complicated picture, as you can see from that, Isaac.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're going to stay right in chapter 1. This is it's at the beginning of the book. So for those who are interested in this book, this part really grabs you into the book. I'm going to read from the first page. You could probably stop sharing your screen at this point.
Shall I stop the share? Yeah,
you can stop. All
there
right.
we are. Okay.
A king sits motionless astride his jet black horse and waits. His black velvet robes flutter slightly in the cold breeze of an early January day, and his horse paws the muddy ground impatiently. The man's bearded face betrays profound grief. Though his bearing is dignified and his sorrow is echoed in the faces of the handful of retainers watching on foot behind him. Another king and his queen are mounted face to face with him, their lavish clothes embroidered in red and gold, their richly caparisoned horses and vast host of attendants, striking a sharp contrast with his modest, sober attire and retinue. There is utterant silence, taking one foot from the stirrup. The king bows his head slowly, then leans down to hand the bunch of magnificent keys he is holding to a page, who takes them and gives them ceremoniously to the king dressed in red. Can you talk a little bit about that scene right there? I think it's like eloquently written. It's a perfect setup. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you, Isaac. Thank you very much. Well, yeah, I think it's a crucial scene because it epitomizes that vital historical moment at the heart of Sultan Boabdil's reign. And it shows the conflict between Christian and Muslim as it's expressed in quite a famous Spanish painting by a painter called Francisco de Pradilla. And I don't know, could I just share that painting with, so they can see? So here is the painting, which in a sense illustrates what I was writing about. And it was a very, very popular painting. It has a political theme, of course, this painting. And so it shows the triumph of King Ferdinand and Isabella, Queen Isabella on the right. They're the Christian monarchs.
Maybe you can make it bigger, the
bigger?
photo. Yeah, but if you maybe click on it, maybe they get bigger because it's a little small.
How's that? Is that better?
It's still showing the same size.
Is it? Oh, sorry. Sorry, I did click on it, and it has got bigger on my screen.
Okay.
So I probably can't get it much bigger. That's a pity. But anyway, it represents obviously the triumph of Catholicism over Islam, but actually Boabdil is sort of presented quite sympathetically, I think, in this, which is quite interesting. So it epitomizes that moment of triumph for one side and disaster for the other, really. So that, I think that's why, yeah, it's quite a telling moment that to start the book with, because it sort of says it all. It encapsulates everything that's going to come, really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Throughout the book, there's a mention of Christianity and Islam, of course. Can you talk more about what you write? By 711, Islam was growing powerful, and Spain's proximity to Africa made it vulnerable to attack. There had already been friendly trading expeditions to Spain from North Africa for some years, and these sorties emboldened the Muslims in their desire to possess the Spanish lands that they had glimpsed. So can you talk more about how religion played a role during this time period?
Yeah, so you mean right at the beginning, Isaac, of the time of the Muslim invasion? Yes, of course. Well, I suppose two parts to this, really. In what was the Hispanic Peninsula, at that time in the year 711, it was ruled by the Visigoths, who were a Germanic tribe who had come to Spain in the 5th century, really as sort of caretakers for the Roman government. And they had stayed, and initially they had been Christians. They belonged to the sect of Arianism, which was quite a sort of obscure sect at the time. But by the 6th century, they converted to Catholicism, so they were Catholic. So basically, the Spanish Peninsula in 711, when King Roderick fought the Muslims at the Battle of Guadalete and was defeated, was a Catholic place. But we do know from Christian chroniclers that the Visigoths were they'd become very lax, very licentious, not very pious anymore. And so those chroniclers blame the decadence of the Visigoths really for what they perceived as a disaster, which they saw as the fall of Spain. So that was really what was happening on the one side. On the other side of the Strait of Gibraltar, so just 7 miles away across the sea, in North Africa, most of the inhabitants were Muslims by that time. There were a few Christians there, but basically the Muslim rule came from Damascus at that time, and the caliphate there was ruled by a dynasty called the Umayyad dynasty, and they ruled under the banner of what I think they would call Islam, although it probably wasn't formulated as clearly as it is today, any more than Christianity was formulated, immediately in the years after Christ. But they wanted to expand their territory, so this was a kind of expansionist policy. Excuse me. So there were conversions to Islam after the conquest of Spain, undoubtedly, and that happened, I think, quite easily because, as I said, a lot of the Visigothic people were really disaffected. They weren't very pious. They weren't very interested in Catholicism, in religious observance. So it was probably quite easy for them to be converted to another faith, in fact. I mean, there is a view that the motivation for the Muslims to come over to Spain was a material one, because as you read out, they had come over very often to exchange goods in trade, really for actually several centuries before this. So it was quite a familiar thing for them to do. So booty, material gain, the riches of the Visigothic kingdom were in their sights, as well as it being a religious motivation too.
So I have a question. Who led this Muslim conquest? I was reading that Tariq was commonly seen as the one who led this conquest. Is there any truth to that?
Yes, as far as we know, that's right. Tariq ibn Ziyad was a former slave, and he was made the leader of the Muslim troops. We think probably there were about 7,000 of them, but nobody really knows how many there were. And they were sent by the governor of North Africa, who was called Musa. And there's a very good story, which I like, that when Tariq and his men arrived on the shore of Spain, what becomes Spain, they arrived at the Rock of Gibraltar. And Tariq climbed right to the top and surveyed his whole new domain. And that's how Gibraltar got its name. It means Tariq's rock in Arabic transliteration. So yes, there's quite a lot of historical evidence for that being the case.
So besides this conversion to Islam, what kind of contributions or impact do the Moors bring? I mean, you have 7 centuries. So what's going on in this sort of vast time period as they now have expanded their territory?
That's a big question. Well, the first thing they did really was establish what became a caliphate in Cordoba. And the peak of that caliphate was in the 8th and 9th centuries. And then Cordoba was the most extraordinary place, probably in Europe. It was incredibly sophisticated. It had over 70 libraries with 4,000 volumes in them. That would probably appeal to you as a librarian. It was a very, very sophisticated civilization. They had running water, baths. They had street lights at a time when in London there were just mud streets and sort of candlelight. They had paved streets in Cordoba. So it was a very, very elegant, sophisticated civilization that was created there. Mm-hmm. And over the centuries, as you may know, an awful lot of what was originally Greek learning translated into Arabic was brought into Spain by the Muslims, and they were absolutely expert in science, agriculture, medicine, arts, philosophy. Mm-hmm. And so they translated, a lot of this got translated into Latin and then found its way into the rest of Europe. So in a way, Spain was the source of an awful lot of the knowledge that was used in medieval universities throughout Europe. So it was a combination of extraordinary, I suppose, scientific knowledge, sophisticated lifestyle, wonderful poetry, just really sophistication and expert knowledge in all sorts of spheres. Wonderful architecture, as we can still see today in the Alhambra and in the Great Mosque. So, mm-hmm. So in a nutshell, that's what was brought by the Muslims, apart from obviously the Islamic faith.
So what was the Spanish response? I mean, they're still the dominant, I guess, race at that point still, even with, the Moors invading. What was their response once they arrived and pretty much start taking over?
Well, I think one of the big surprises to the Muslims was how easy it was for them to take over the country. So in fact, they took over virtually all of what we call Spain now, apart from the small mountain kingdom of Navarre, right in the very north, which held out and resisted. And they would have got further right up into northern France if they hadn't been stopped at Poitiers by Charles Martel. I think that was 737, mm-hmm. 732. So for the first, I suppose, 200 or 300 years, the people who had been Christians were allowed to, or were still Christians, were allowed to carry on with their Christian faith, provided they paid certain taxes, mm-hmm. Under Muslim rule. And this, in fact, an awful lot of the native Christians were very, very enchanted with the Muslim lifestyle, and they learned Arabic and converted to Islam to the extent that one of the religious writers, priests called Orosius, wrote that he was absolutely dismayed that none of the Christians knew the native language or Latin anymore. They all spoke Arabic. So they a lot of Christians became completely acclimatized to the Arabic way of life. But it wasn't really until the 11th century when the tide began to turn and the whole idea of what was called a Christian reconquest, mm-hmm. began to take shape. It was an idea that had been sort of bubbling away on the back burner since, well, really the 9th century in the north of Spain. And then it really gained momentum, I think because crusades in other countries were happening. The crusade in Jerusalem was happening around this time, and the Catholic Pope was very keen to encourage a kind of militant approach to anything heretical. And And so from that was the tipping point, really, in the 11th century. In 1085, the Christian armies in Spain reconquered Toledo from the Arabs, which was quite a big thing for them, because Toledo originally had been the Visigothic capital, and so they felt they'd regained an important part of their territory. And then after that, the Christians began to push further and further south and capture more and more cities, until finally Granada was the only place left, the province of Granada. So it was completely enclosed and independent from the rest of Spain.
What were some of the internal conflicts with the Moors? Because I'm sure they didn't all get along.
No, no, they didn't. Well, there were the inevitable power struggles between clans, mistrust. There was the clan called the Abencerrajes, who were all slaughtered by Boabdil's grandfather in the Alhambra because he believed they'd betrayed him. So that was a terrible thing, and the repercussions of that lasted for centuries, really. There was tremendous enmity. But probably one of the worst struggles were the power struggles in Boabdil's family, between Boabdil and his father, and Boabdil's father and his own brother, Sagal, for supremacy. And added to that, as if that wasn't enough, Boabdil's father, of course, had a legitimate wife who was Aisha, who was Boabdil's mother, but he took up with a young Christian girl, a captive, and made her his queen, and renounced Aisha, and Boabdil, who was a legitimate heir, was ousted. So this was a terrible power struggle in the Nasrid dynasty at that time. And you know, if you look back at all those different emirs that we saw on the lineage chart, this wasn't in a particularly unusual situation. They'd been poisoning each other to try and win the throne for generations, unfortunately. So it was a fundamentally very unstable dynasty. That being said, it was very similar to what happened in the royal houses of Spain, in Castile and Aragon. There were similar power struggles, similar dynastic rivalries, and so on. So it was probably more the nature of things and the nature of medieval things than specifically being, you know, a part of the Muslim psyche or something like that.
Can you talk a little bit about the women, the role that women played during this time and in the book?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, generally speaking, Muslim women were in a very subservient role, generally probably in a much more subservient role in some ways than Christian women were. They were supposed to stay at home, keep themselves veiled. The only women really, generally, sorry, who had a reasonable amount of freedom were the dancers at the royal court and the sort of members of the harem. They had access, of course, to a lot of court secrets, and they did have quite a bit of freedom. We know there were a number of female poets in the Muslim community of Al-Andalus, but not really at Boabdil's time. What's interesting, though, I think, is the power his mother had, because she had a special claim to royal power, because she was supposed to be descended from the Prophet Muhammad, and so she had a direct link to the royal lineage, and her son could inherit his right to the throne through her rather than through the father, because she was apparently related to the Prophet. Also interesting that Abu Hassan, who was Boabdil's father's second queen, who was called Zoraya, she had tremendous power as well over the Sultan, and he gave her a great wealth and lots of land, which she sold after the fall of Granada for a huge amount of money. So both Aisha and Soraya were wealthy women with a lot of power in this context, and that is, I think, quite interesting. Maybe not surprising because they were royal, but nevertheless, I think they had an unusual degree of influence and power in that society.
I'm going to ask you to read a passage from the book. You may.
Okay. Okay. Well, the one I chose, Isaac, although I did have my eye on the first one, but you very nicely read that, so thank you for that. What I've decided to read is basically it's a letter written by one of Boabdil's chroniclers, who was called Hernando de Baeza, and he lived at the royal court, the Nasrid court, and he spent a lot of time with Boabdil, and he admired him greatly. And it's interesting because Hernando was a converted, he came from a Jewish family, but he was a Christian convert. And in this passage, Boabdil has asked him by messenger if he would go on his behalf to the Christian court to see King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. So Hernando isn't quite sure about this to start with. So he says, I didn't decide to do this at once because it was dangerous to enter the Albaycin, which is where Boabdil had his court at that time. Boabdil had known of me since his visit to Alcaudete, which was a small town near Granada, on his release from prison, where he made an appeal to the grandees of Andalusia. I was living there at the time, and a great friend of mine, one of the Sultan's personal guards, acted as intermediary through whom he communicated in a very friendly way with me. A few days later, the city proclaimed him their king, and he wrote to me again. So finally, Hernando says, I went to the Albaycin, where I communicated at length with his royal person and with his mother and wife, daughter, servants, and ladies in waiting. All I have written about his imprisonment I heard in his own words when he was speaking to me alone. He talked to me in Castilian, although he spoke it with a heavy local accent, which was quite difficult to understand. One day I asked him why he didn't speak in Castilian more often, as he knew it so well, and he answered in a way that I thought worthy of mentioning, saying, yes, I do speak it, but I am not completely fluent. I'm afraid of making a mistake, and a mistake in the speech of kings is very undesirable. I felt these were the words of a great person, and as God is my witness, that in the 3 or 4 years that I knew him, he was indeed great. And I really believe that if he had been a Christian, he would have been one of the best that ever was. So I chose that because I think it's fascinating, firstly, because we get a direct account of Boabdil's words, and also Hernando's words too. So we hear the Sultan speak through him, if you like. And also, it's an example of how very favorably he was viewed by the people at the time. Here he's presented as a good linguist, a man who's educated, and also a humble man. And it's not the first time or the only time that Hernando calls him a great man. And that was echoed in a number of royal chronicles. Royal chronicler to Aragon, Zorita, called him good and great. He was described as being greatly loved by his people, by Pulgar, who was the royal chronicler of Castile. And so it's interesting that the view of him, as it's presented by people writing about him at the time, is nothing like the later views of him, where he became demonized, much more imaginative views in literature and other writing, where he became viewed as a coward and a traitor. There's no evidence to show that he was either of those things and quite the opposite in actual contemporary writing.
Why do you think that view of him changed over time?
Well, that's a very good question too. Funnily enough, the main reason was the publication of a book in the 16th century by a writer called Pérez de Ita. And he was actually a shoemaker, but he was also a good writer. And he wrote a book called The Civil Wars of Granada. And it was all about the Nasrid court. And it was written in a very popular way. It had lots of popular ballads and songs in it and anecdotes. And what he wanted to do, which actually was to show the glamour of the Muslim court. But in it, he attributed that terrible massacre of the Abencerrajes I mentioned earlier, not to Boabdil's father, but to Boabdil. And he does a complete character assassination of Boabdil in the book. And the book was incredibly popular in Spain. And then its reputation spread outside Spain. And that idea of Boabdil as being violent or as being a traitor or a coward, as he was portrayed by Pérez de Ita, took hold and it got developed. So I would say from my researchers that it was an entirely literary phenomenon, which had a very powerful influence on how he was perceived until way into the 19th century.
You mentioned in the book, after Boabdil is defeated, he's able to stay in Spain for a short period of time, and
yes.
then he's kicked out of Spain. Can you talk more about why that decision was changed?
Yes. Well, initially, he was told by his conquerors, Ferdinand and Isabella, that he could have access to a big estate in the region nearby called the Alpujarras, which is quite a mountainous region. But he went there with his family, and he seemed to get some relaxation while he was there. There are reports that he spent a lot of time hunting while he was there. But the Catholic monarchs felt that he was still too much of a threat, and that at any time he might start a new uprising against them if he was actually, well, within striking distance of Granada, I suppose. And I think that there was, that there maybe was some justification in that. And so basically they made his life so uncomfortable and awkward, mainly through their royal secretary, who was called Hernando de Zafra, who was constantly chivying Boabdil to go into exile. But finally, he saw that probably it was the only thing he could viably do. And at the same time, just before he went into exile, his wife Moraima died, and as far as we know, he was extremely devoted to her. Funnily enough, he was one of the royal sultans who never had a harem, as far as we know. He was monogamous. And I think that was a great blow too. And so he felt that the time had come for him to strike out and try and make a new life. It was rather ironic that when Ferdinand and Isabella definitely knew that he was going to go, that they asked whether once he was there, he'd be prepared to fight on their side if they tried to win any territory in North Africa. And that got a very flat refusal. It was no way he was going to countenance anything like that. So I think that was the reason why it was just too uncomfortable to have him so close by, basically.
What are some of the big takeaways you want readers to get from reading your book?
Now I thought about this, Isaac. So yeah, I had some thoughts about this. I suppose the basic thing to start with is that I hoped that the book would draw attention to the historical and cultural importance of Boabdil's life and times, not just for Europe, but also globally. And I think what I mean by that is globally, is that from the perspective of the Christian victory, it gave Queen Isabella the authority and power to equip Columbus's first expedition in 1492. And it's interesting that within 50 years of his arrival in Central America, Spanish Castile had conquered, well, most areas from Texas to Argentina, and they'd established the framework of a political, economic, religious and social life that under which those inhabitants would live for many years to come. And of course, they were able to do that because for 7 centuries, they had been conquering and administering and Christianizing the inhabitants of Spanish Al-Andalus, so they knew how to go about it. So I think that's one very important thing to bear in mind. The other thing I think I'd like perhaps readers to take away from the book would be that from the perspective of Boabdil's life, we might reflect that the most striking aspect of his personality was his desire to follow the path of peace wherever possible, and to negotiate rather than kill, and to seek reconciliation rather than wield a sword. So in that regard, he was a very unconventional sultan. And so I think that partly for those reasons, he is a hero for our times, and because he's revealed, if you like, an alternative way of resolving cultural and religious conflict. So I think he's worthy of our attention because of that.
We're coming down to the final minutes. For someone who's interested in learning more about the Moors, what direction would you point them if they're learning it for the first time? Of course, read this book, but aside from that.
Yeah, well, I think probably reading a good general history of that time would be a good thing to do. There's a wonderful book by an American scholar, sadly now dead, Maria Rosa Menocal, and she wrote a book called The Ornament of the World. I don't know if any of the listeners has heard of that, but that's all about Islamic culture in Spain, written from a very beautiful perspective. So that would be a very good place to start, I would think, because it gives you a kind of overview of the sort of contribution that they made to Spanish civilization and European civilization.
All right, where can people buy your book?
They can buy it on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
And they should be able to buy it in good bookshops, I hope.
Okay.
And you can also buy it. You can buy it in ebook, as well as a hard copy.
Just want to thank you for coming on. We are coming to an end. The Jersey City Free Public Library. It's been a pleasure having you here, and we just want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Isaac. It's been an honor to join you, and thank you for inviting me again. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for listening.